he continues to do so, and that's another major reason why. I mean, but why do people believe him? I mean,
of course, people are not believing him more and more. And again, you go back to John Daly, and I mean, Gore's become the target of it. But but of course, what they do is they move the goalposts again. So now we got cap and trade. It's the same old carbon credits and carbon tax, but cap means, we're going to cap this nasty pollution. Well, CO2 isn't a pollutant, and Gore's and the EPA, by the way, have bypassed the Senate and the politicians. The EPA now have the authority, approved by the Supreme Court, to say CO2 is a pollutant, and we can go in and shut down any industry we want, or find any industry. So they bypass the political option there. But this control of the CO2 is right at the heart of it. But the cap and trade, so we're going to cap that nasty pollution. We're going to have trade. So, trade is good. Yeah, that's good. So it's the spin again. It's the playing on words again, and it's the same thing. With the Arctic ice. How many people know that every single summer 9 million square kilometers of ice melts? That's normal. And it melts at the rate of 62,000 square kilometers a day. That's normal. But how many people know that? And when I go back to my comment about, they're exploiting people's lack of understanding and knowledge, and here's what they've actually been able to achieve is they are telling you that normal events are abnormal, which means then they never run out of things to say. Because tomorrow there'll be more normal events. And really, I don't care what your listeners phone in and tell me about. I can explain it, how it is part of the natural process. Now, outside of that, does that mean that we don't have some pollution that is concentrations of certain things that are possibly damaged? Absolutely. But here's one of the sad things about it. We spent so much money on the climate change issue that could have been better spent on these other things. In Canada, for example, Environment Canada, our equivalent to your NOAA, spent $6.8 billion, and that's not much for U.S., but for Canada it's huge, in approximately 6 years on climate change, when they didn't even meet their own targets on air pollution. And so this is another part of the damage that these people are doing.
Yeah, and once again, coming back to the issue of CO2, and the fact that Gore kept those two graphs separate and inconvenient truth, because he didn't want to show that it's not the CO2 driving the temperature, but it's actually the temperature that's driving the CO2. Is there any evidence at all that CO2 affects the temperature of the Earth?
No. The only place, and I've said this in some of my publications, the only place where CO2 drives temperature is in the computer models at the IPCC. In every single record of any duration for any period in history, the temperature change precedes the CO2. And by the way, the famous graph that came out in 1991 showing the ice core record for Antarctica over 420,000 years, produced by Jalzel, a French glaciologist. And he, at the time, I remember when this came out because I brought it into a graduate seminar. He, at the time, said, don't rush to judgment on this. But, of course, they saw this. Here's the temperature going up and the CO2 going up and down. There's the proof. Well, even the IPCC now concede that in that graph, the temperature change precedes the CO2 change. But that hasn't made them change what they put into their computer models. In the computer model, they're programmed that if a CO2 increases, the temperature will go up. And here just to illustrate how frustrating this has been for me and people like Richard Lindzen, there is what I call the black paint syndrome. Mm-hmm. If you want to block light coming through a window, put a coat of black paint on. That'll block about 96, 90, whatever percentage of the light coming through. The second coat of paint, yes, it'll block a small percentage more, but its effect. In other words, there's a point of saturation with the black paint. Well, that is true of CO2 in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. That the current levels are holding back as much heat as it could. So even if you double and triple CO2 in the atmosphere, the temperature can only go up by a very, very small amount. Mm-hmm. And there's a debate about how much there is. Lindzen says 0.56 degrees Celsius. The IPCC, say 1.5. But what they did was they said, oh, well, there's a positive feedback here, that the temperature goes up because of the CO2. That causes more water vapor, which is the most important greenhouse gas. It's 95%. Right, okay. Mm-hmm. So they say, oh, the water vapor then makes the temperature go up, and therefore there's this positive feedback. Well, we now know that's not true, because all of their computer models of predictions of what should happen with the moisture in the atmosphere, water vapor, and the temperature increase has simply not happened. And so even that, which is again built into their theory, is turned out to be false. And so, as I said, and the other part of this on the other side, of course, is they've completely ignored the fact that CO2 is an important greenhouse gas, but not for climate, but for plants.
Yeah. Why don't you talk a little bit about the benefits? Because there are a lot of benefits of CO2 historically, even, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. There's a wonderful graph of 600 million years of record of temperature and CO2. There's no correlation between them at all. The current level of CO2 in the atmosphere is 385 parts per million. And by the way, if people want real detail on CO2, Sherwood Idso, who's been studying it for years, and his son Craig have got a wonderful site called co2science.org. Well, the current level of 385 parts per million, ITSO has shown that if you increase that to about 1,200 parts per million, the plants grow 4 times more effectively and vigorously. In other words, you could argue the plants are malnourished at 385 parts per million. Now, why is that the case? Well, if you look at that geologic record, you see that for the last 300 million years, which is essentially when the plants we have evolved, the average level of CO2 in the atmosphere was 1,200 parts per million over that 300 million years. And so, and Gore and these people are saying, oh, well, we've got to reduce the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, if you get down to 250 parts per million, the plants start to die, and at 150 parts per million, the plants die, and then, of course, there's no oxygen, and all life is dead, and maybe they've then achieved their purpose of getting rid of life on Earth. But so the benefits of CO2 are to plants, and in fact, a lawyer and a climate expert, Bill Orr, and I filed a brief with the EPA, and one of the things we put in it was that we are going to seek power of attorney on behalf of the plants, so that if they vote to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, we want to vote on behalf of the plants because they need more.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's my understanding that the Little Ice Age and the medieval optimum originally appeared in the IPCC reports. Is that correct?
Well, that's a very nice loop, because we're getting near the end of our program. I talked about Hubert Lamb, the founder of the CRU. He produced a graph that showed how warm it was in the medieval warm period, centering around 1000 AD. The Vikings were sailing in Arctic waters that are now permanent pack ice. And then he showed this drop down to the Little Ice Age, in fact, named it. Mm-hmm. And it centers around 1680, and the fur trade makes no sense unless you understand how cold it was in the 17th century. We've been warming since then. That graph that Lamb produced was in the 1995 report. And it became a real problem for them, because they were saying, oh no, the 20th century is warmest ever. And people like myself and other skeptics were saying, well, hang on a minute, what about this medieval warm period?
Right.
Okay, well then there's that famous email from Jonathan Overpeck, who is right in the heart of these emails in CRU, saying we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. They achieved that with the hockey stick graph.
There you go.
Okay, now the hockey stick graph is rubbish to start off with, because they make the assumption that trees grow, the primary control on tree growth is temperature. It isn't. It's precipitation. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I mean, just none of it bears scrutiny, and if you understand it, you very quickly see how they completely cooked the books, and now they're exposed, and they're still trying to deny. And of course they can say, well, you know, oh, these are just meaningless emails. No, they're not, if you really know what they're saying.
Okay, well, let's take another break. Final segment straight ahead, listeners. Stay with us. This is Govern America.